Hey, my name is Mo. I'm a mostly normal guy with a very unrelated day job. Today I'd like to welcome you to the third installment in a series of conversations I'm hosting with relevant figures in the UAP disclosure space. My goal in hosting these conversations is simple. I'd like to elevate the level of discourse, reduce stigma associated with the topic, and hopefully provide resources that can help regular people get up to speed without getting lost in a cacophony of noise. In today's episode, I'll be sitting down with Ronak Patel to discuss a variety of themes and initiatives relevant to the current discourse. Ronak is, as he puts it, just a regular guy. But over the past few months, he's a regular guy who's made easily over 100 calls to elected officials and ensuring that the UAP topic is on their agenda. He's also disseminated a lot of useful call scripts and other nuggets of information for folks that are looking to get active in a meaningful way. That's why, in my opinion, Ronak is actually the epitome of an informed and engaged citizen who can serve as a shining example of the potential that each and every one of us has to take action. Before we dive in, as always, I want to underscore that I have no inside information of any sorts, nor do I have any real concrete theories as to what is actually going on. My opinion changes on a weekly basis as new information comes out. In a time where the Overton window keeps evolving so rapidly, I think it's very normal to expect one's opinions on the topic to oscillate quite wildly. One thing that will never oscillate wildly, however, is my desire to seek the truth. And without further ado, here's Ronak. Ronak, it's a pleasure to have you here. You're genuinely, I mean this genuinely, you're quite an inspiration for a lot of the stuff that I've been working on. And I'm not just saying that to fluff you up, but maybe for the people that aren't as familiar, tell us a little bit about yourself. We don't even need to get into the UAP stuff just yet, but who are you and why are you here, so to speak?
Yeah, sure thing. I'm really grateful to be here, Mo, and I really appreciate everything that you do as well. And looking forward to a great discussion here. But a little bit about myself. I'm currently in the medical field as a graduate student, and that ties into my interest with UAP from an academic standpoint a bit. But in terms of how I kind of got started in the whole UAP bit, I mean, I'm just a regular Joe, and felt like we as citizens can take action, and felt that that was the right thing to do, and just started doing that myself. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Like, and I mentioned this to you, I think, a little bit before we got on this call. Um, there's a lot of Ross Coultharts, there's David Grushes, there's all these kind of big characters and actors that are doing a lot of great stuff on a pretty large scale, let's say. But what you and I have in common is I think we're just mostly, regular folks that had a casual interest maybe a couple years ago that grew to a little bit more than a casual interest, perhaps. And ultimately, I think
Yeah.
if I can speak for you as well, I think we just thought, hey, what's going on here, and is there anything that we could be doing to perhaps move the needle, even on an individual scale? It doesn't necessarily have to be some giant initiative, but I think ultimately every citizen has a role to play on any topic, and we're just trying to make the UAP topic a topic. So it's really great to have you here, and I think it's just hopefully another step in kind of normalizing the conversation about it. So I'm curious, when actually did you, because you have a Twitter page, which I'll pull up later. When did you start kind of posting about UAP, and how quickly did you kind of get into activism as well? And maybe if you could give us an idea of some of the things that you've done over the past few months. And in the meantime, I'll try and find those things on Twitter as well.
Yeah, sure thing. And I really appreciate all that you just said, Mo. Um, just trying to have a normal conversation, trying to normalize this subject, and trying to have a conversation without the stigma. Um, and I think that you're already doing a great job doing so. But for me on Twitter, I was before on Twitter, I was looking at the UAP subject from a really far bird's eye view, just kind of following some of the figures, such as, different journalists like Ross Coulthart, Christopher Sharp. There's so many out there. And then, of course, certain government figures such as Lou Elizondo or Christopher Mellon, and just kind of paying attention to the different news and the developments like that. But with Twitter, I would say it really started off for me by having a conversation with Representative Burchett back in May. Um, and this was a purely serendipitous moment for me. I was coming out of class actually, and that day I just pulled up Twitter kind of like towards the end of class, when everyone's packing their things up and getting ready to go. And on my feed, I saw Representative Tim Burchett was having a town hall over the phone where you can just call in.
Yep.
And in my head, I was like, I mean, it was just a no-brainer to me, so I had to do it. Uh, and as I was getting into my car, I made the call, and Representative Burchett was doing his introduction, and then over the line, they're like, "Press dial this number if you want to ask Representative Burchett a question," and I immediately pressed that button so fast, and I ended up being like the second person in queue. And then I started getting a bit nervous. I'm like, oh, what am I going to ask? Like, this is just
Hmm.
because, as I mentioned, it was serendipitous. Um, but the week prior, I had just started sort of engaging with staffers, and I kind of started out by engaging with his staffers because at that time on Twitter, the word was that Representative Burchett was going to hold a hearing with the House Oversight Committee.
Yep.
And so I had just a couple just generic conversations with his staffers. So this kind of took it up to the next level, actually speaking with him directly. And I ended up just simply asking him straightforward with if he could just provide any updates with this hearing that was in the works back then. As I mentioned, this call happened, I believe it was May 9th. And uh, in addition to providing updates, if he was considering inviting Lou Elizondo, the former director of ATIP, in addition to military pilots and other personnel that have seen UAP. And he gave me a really thoughtful answer to that question. It wasn't just short, like, yeah, we're working on it. He pretty much said that at that time he was in negotiations with the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, at that time, and Chairman Comer. So that was good to hear. And he mentioned that he's a good buddy with Lou, and but that for this first hearing, the focus would be on hearing from pilots.
Yep.
And I thought that was really great to hear. And he mentioned there's a lot of people looking into this. We have, of course, the aviators saying military aviators are seeing things out there, but we also have scientists looking into this. Um, and then after that, I shared that, and that a lot of people uh, saw that and were thanking me for just asking that question and just kind of getting that out there. And so for me, that was a really kind of a wake up call, I guess, or kind of a light bulb moment like, wow. And it just motivated me to continuing to engage with staffers, getting to engage with actual representative or senator as next level. And I've been looking at, town halls and trying to figure maybe one out for the future. But, we have folks like Matt Laszlo, for example, that
Yep.
are
Boots on the
keeping up
ground.
that UAP. Yeah, exactly. They're keeping up that UAP beat in Congress for us, the people, and it's really awesome. But through this process, I was also waking up to. Before this, I never really had done any sort of advocacy,
Hmm.
and Vinnie Adams and one of his collaborators at that time, Katie Howland, they put together, I believe it was like two different call scripts for essentially two different call to actions. And I had seen those back then, which I think this is like 2022. And at that time, I was interested. I was interested in the UAP topic pretty heavily since 2020. Um, but I felt like taking action. But I was nervous picking up the phone, and but
Mm-hmm.
ended up following their call script and really appreciated the way they broke it down. Like, here's what we're doing, and here's this call script and how you can go about it. So I just kind of followed it. But then that was it. After I made that call, like I didn't think about, oh, I should keep doing that. So a few months down the line, and then all of this happens, and so then it was like, okay, wow, like there's something here. And to put it simply, I mean, it's as citizens in the United States, it's our right to engage with Congress. I mean, after all, these people represent us, so we should be utilizing that avenue at the very least. Um, rather than complaining or groaning about the government. I get it, and I know things don't happen quick in Washington, as we're seeing with the UAP subject. Um, but it is important that we utilize that because it is
Agreed.
our right.
Agreed.
And
And there's a bare
yeah,
minimum, right? And as you said, it's not about,
yeah,
or it's extremely unlikely that you're going to get some sort of instant results, right? But one thing, it's a
totally.
bit of a cliche, but you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? So if
Yeah,
nobody's picking up the phones, if nobody's emailing them, if nobody's letting them know these things, well, then I can assure you nothing will happen. And I think, the least we can do, as you say, is do what you can on an individual scale and kind of put the message out there for other folks to do the same. So I also just quickly want to pull up, I think how or one of the first things I saw as well from your side was a lot of these kind of speaker, or what do you call scripts that you shared on Twitter,
yeah,
which I thought was really useful and really cool. And as you know, I actually implemented these on my website as well at the time. And I think a lot of people, because I know I felt the same when there's a bit of apprehension when you think, oh, I'm going to call my congressman or congresswoman or senator,
yeah.
and I'm going to talk to them about UAP. Are they going to be able to take me seriously? It's a little bit embarrassing, perhaps. So I was
Dude,
wondering if you could
yeah,
maybe add some color to that kind of experience as well, and just so folks know what that's like.
sure, yeah. So with these call scripts, when I started with that, I was basing it off of my actual conversations that I was having. And in the beginning, I put one when David Grush came forward. I had put a call script out, I believe, like 2 days later. And looking back, I mean, it's pretty generic, and the text is small, so it's like the formatting. I was just starting to play around with it,
Mm-hmm.
but I just felt like putting it out there. Like it's a start. It's something,
Exactly.
and and then a few days later, I ended up like revising it, put that out there, and back then it got a decent amount of traction. But formatting wise, looking back, I'm like, oh, I could have done that better. But it was just great to at least get support even during those times, and I'm just really appreciative from those beginning days back in like May and June from just so many people in the space of the UFO community. Just a lot of support, and I'm just really really thankful, and a lot of feedback too, because that's what kind of led me to, at least with the that call script for the select committee on UAP. I mean, that was just a culmination of getting feedback and uh, trying to perfect how to engage during that call with those staffers, because some of my call scripts in the beginning, if some folks have seen them, were like way too long. And so the thing with that is these congressional staffers, they're busy, busy, busy. They have to go from one call to the next. So it's best to try to and condense and just have your message in like a short, concise way. And it's hard to do that because you want to kind of say more and build kind of a good
Elaborate.
case for what you're saying. And so that's kind of been where my personal challenge was in those calls. But with the calls, pretty much the way that I've been putting out the scripts out there is you just kind of start off by saying, hey, you could say your name if you want to. If you're a direct constituent of said representative in the House or any of your senators, definitely mention that.
Yeah, that
Um,
makes a big difference, right? If they know it's their
yeah,
own
huge,
constituent.
huge difference. And so you can mention some of your personal information and then just say, I'm calling about UAP or unidentified anomalous phenomenon. And you can mention something else if it's something specific within the UAP subject. You can always tailor your message to how you want to, but that's just a good way to start it off. So then they're just like, yeah, sure thing. Sometimes they'll collect more information from you just so when they log your message, especially if you're a constituent, they want to make sure they have things like your zip code, your address, your phone number, so they can reach back out to you and just also verify that you are a constituent. So there might be some information exchanged there, but then after that, they'll be like, all right, go for it. So that's when I've been putting out these call scripts and the last few ones trying to just whittle down the message to maybe where
The
it's about two
essence.
paragraphs. And the way that I've also based that is I've had some of those longer conversations like earlier on in the summer, and then dialing it down and having a more concise message definitely has made a difference. And I think getting the message across, because over this time, and I've made quite a few calls, honestly, I wish looking back that I had logged like each and every call, because it's over a 100 at the very, very,
Wow,
very least.
for sure over 100.
Very,
Triple digits.
very least. But the vibe of the staffers over time, especially like I said, getting that message down more concise. Uh, some of them genuinely were like, I did have some conversations with these staffers where they were just genuinely like, wow, that was a really good message. Sometimes they had a little interest in UAP. And that's another thing, like I think nowadays we definitely have more people making calls to Congress about UAP, which is so awesome. It's been a very collective and collaborative effort to get to this point where we are today. But um, yeah, it's these staffers before were not getting a lot of calls on UAP, but the
That's what I
subject
was curious
alone is
about. If you've
very.
seen any difference in kind of how the responses are and things like that.
Exactly, because this subject is very interesting. So it's going to perk their ears up, and even more so if some of these staffers are, let's say, their legislative directors or even chief of staff, sometimes answering the phone. Like each and every time you get to a staffer, it may not just be some low level intern, as they say, or just a staff assistant. Like sometimes it is the legislative director calling, or like I said, the chief of staff, or someone more high up in the staff of that office. And this has personally happened to me, and it's kind of mind blowing. So that's why throughout this whole UAP advocacy bit, I've also tried to emphasize to folks to be respectful when engaging with staffers, because we can't have a bad impression associated with this subject. I mean, we in general you have to be respectful with. Doesn't matter what you're talking about, right? So let's apply it to the UAP subject, because unfortunately that could add on to the stigma as well.
Absolutely.
Um,
I think a lot of folks
so
have quite a bit of pent up vitriol. I've seen it definitely on Twitter and things like that. So I think that's an important point as well. There's understandably, I think to some extent there's this feeling of resentment, perhaps of associations of alleged cover ups and things like that. But there's a time and place for those kind of conversations, and as you say,
yeah,
especially when you're speaking to staffers who ultimately you're asking them to look into something. I think
hmm
respect and some level of neutrality and just kind of raising the issue as just another issue, I think is really important.
yeah, I agree. And keeping it bipartisan as well. I've engaged with Republican representatives and senators, but also Democratic representatives and senators. And also the way I'll base some of my calls, some of the personal calls that I'll just make from day to day or week to week, is it depends on maybe some developments going on. For example, Senator Gillibrand back in July had expressed to Matt Laszlo that she would like to hold a public hearing with the whistleblowers, including David Grush. I think at that time she said if he was, if him and the whistleblowers were comfortable being on camera, then why not? And so around then, myself and Vinnie Adams from Disclosure Team, shout out to him. He's been super supportive. But we did a collaboration back then where we put out these graphics. It was a call script and then kind of an explainer like why we're doing this, explained the situation with David Grush coming forward. We have senators looking into this, and that Senator Gillibrand has expressed at least her intentions back then that she would like to hold a hearing. So let's push for that. And also, one thing that was emphasized during that push back then was ensuring whistleblower protection, because one of the things that blew my mind through David Grush's allegations, which we can definitely get into that subject later on because there's quite a bit there, but the non-human crafts and biologics, definitely, wow. I mean, that's mind-blowing to say the least. But to me, what was kind of shook my core a bit was just the amount of secrecy involved and the retaliation.
Yeah.
It just really bothered me to hear that, because we all look up to people in our government, at least people that served in the military, right? But intel community, I mean, they're doing all kinds of important work for the government, even if we may not agree with that. There's a lot of nuances to that, right?
Yeah, and
National
I think at a
security
minimum
is
you can respect the service, right? Like these are people that I think for the most part are patriotic and are doing what they believe to be the right thing, and they've committed serious amounts of time to that. So I
exactly.
absolutely agree to think that there's just some sort of reprisals and maybe even threats is indeed very, very shocking, and is definitely a priority to ensure that that cannot and does not continue. Also, as a means to potentially get some more of these potential whistleblowers out of the woodwork. So
Yeah,
completely agreed. Yeah.
definitely. Yeah,
Maybe on another kind of topic, somewhat related, but there's especially in the last few months, or even I think this this week alone, has been a doozy, as they say.
yeah.
Do you ever struggle to kind of stay focused on your studies or what you're working on amidst all of this kind of noise, if you will?
I will say definitely. Probably more so in the summer, and we all have different things going on in life. For me, school, it's like full time, so that's quite a bit. And with David Grush coming forward, that really changed the game because, as I mentioned a little bit prior, speaking about the call with Representative Burchett, we all were just looking forward to a public hearing with pilots and fingers
Hmm.
crossed, maybe other personnel. And that was our mindset for about a month until June 5th, I believe was the date that the debrief released their article. And then subsequently later on, we had the News Nation interview. And that really changed the game. When David Grush came forward, I mean, it took me a few days to really digest. And I read his background in the debrief article, and I didn't have any reason to really doubt his credibility. But to just take it all in immediately, it just kind of took me a couple of days. Like, wow, this is really happening, and this just takes it to the whole next level. And there's something I could even mention. I had a call with a staffer of Representative Burchett the day that David Grush's news broke out, and I essentially suggested, hey, like, here's what's happening right now. Representative Burchett even tweeted about it this morning, so even he seems interested. I think it'd be great for you guys to consider having this individual testify. And this staffer was someone that, or is somebody that helps Representative Burchett out with the UAP portfolio. So I think they really did take that to heart, and they said that they would discuss that later on in the day. But I mean, with him coming forward, I think it was just a no brainer to have him at the hearing. But back to that was a little bit of a tangent, but back to the whole balance, right? Like keeping up it is definitely hard. I have struggled with that, and but this has all been new for me as well. Getting a lot of engagement on Twitter and a lot of support and pushing these call scripts out. I feel like it definitely does make a difference because it's just, kind of a brick by brick sort of thing. And now we've had quite a bit of advocacy uh, happening in the community. A lot of people have been pushing, especially with the whole end UAP secrecy event that we did back in September. Like, that was 2 weeks that so many people made calls. And so, where I'm in this a little bit too much, it's from the perspective of this has been going on for decades. This UAP phenomenon has been going on for decades. And as David Grush is reporting, and he represents other whistleblowers, that there's been a decades long program or programs that have been evading oversight. And it's just a lot to take in. And I push a lot because of that in a way, like this has just been a long time in coming. And we're just pretty much in a whole new territory with David Grush coming forward, this whole whistleblower situation,
I
inspector
agree.
generals being involved. It's next level. There's so many things that we could just talk about right there. But this is just, yeah, times are different. And so that's sort of where I'm like, this is why we really need to push hard.
I
And
agree. I think
also
there's
just,
quite a bit of momentum. I think is probably the
yeah,
way I would think about it right now.
exactly, exactly. We have momentum from Liberation Times, right? Christopher Sharp doing some superb work,
Fantastic stuff. Yeah.
and it's just insane. And he's been reporting like, Pandora's box has been opened. There's been whistleblowers testifying not only about sightings but contact and
Hmm.
these secretive programs. I mean, so we people paying attention to at least his work have been seeing this coming a little bit, but for it to actually happen and now where we're at, it's, yeah, every day I'm sort of like, wow, this is all real, this is all happening, and it's quite a bit, but we have to remind ourselves of anything that we're doing in life. So for me, it's like schoolwork. I gotta try to stay on top of that. Sorry about that sound that you're hearing.
No
There's a
worries.
projector in this classroom, and it's just doing its own thing right now.
I mean, like I said earlier,
Anyway,
we're not the professionals, right? We're just doing our best here. So I think all of these minor technical difficulties are all par for the course.
um, but yeah, it's we just have to remind ourselves of what we're doing. Got to keep in mind friends and family, work, school, health for sure.
Hmm.
That's something. I'm in the medical field in healthcare, going for that. So it's like I have to remind myself about that. It's like, come on now. But it's hard. We're living in a different world now. The amount of information we're exposed to, the UAP subject is one thing, but just think about everything else that's going on in our world, right? Just
Yeah.
compiled. I mean, I don't know how our brains are made for that. Like 50 years ago, the average person was only exposed to, X amount of information, and now it's unfathomable. But as I mentioned, keeping a balance, we have to just keep in mind about the important things we have in life. And if you have to take a break away from the UAP subject and everything going online with, in Twitter or Reddit, wherever you get your news from, I mean, go for it. And, your mental health is priority. So I would definitely recommend that to everybody. If this gets to be a little too much, like just take a break. Um, and you can always come back to it. And I mean, there's a lot of supportive people out there. So, I mean, we'll always be here for you.
Agreed. And I think also one of the things is, I think a lot of people get caught up in a lot of hypothetical scenarios, which, I love to speculate as much as the next guy. And I think sometimes that can lead to a little bit of stress and maybe even existential stress.
Yeah.
But I think one of the important
Yeah.
things is also to focus on kind of the tangible things where sometimes just taking action, like, okay, if this topic is really bothering you, then perhaps, a good outlet would be call up your congressional staffer and let them know, hey, I find this
True.
topic important. And I think that also just helps you just mentally, like, hey, like at least you're doing something, you're taking action. And then, as you said, it's also about finding balance and making sure you have a life outside of this topic, um, and that you just keep a healthy balance, as you put it.
I agree.
Speaking
I
of
agree.
information, how do you personally actually stay up to date? Because I mean, there's so much going on. What are the kind of ways that you stay up to date with what's going on, and perhaps don't get also lost in a lot of the wilder stuff that's out there?
Yeah, so for me, I get a lot of my information, I will say, from Twitter, just following certain journalists, as I mentioned, some
Hmm.
of the government figures. But now there's different people in the field as well. So I mentioned, Christopher Sharp, Ross Coulthart, but Vinnie Adams of Disclosure Team, Sean
Yeah,
from Witness Citizen. There's so many people. Matt Ford of the Good Trouble Show. He's been
I think
posting a
the
lot of
that
uh,
UFO podcast as well, Dan and Andy, I
that.
believe,
Oh
also
my
great.
god, exactly. Like there's so many, there's just so many podcasts out there. Toe with Kurt,
Also a
Theories of
fantastic show.
Everything,
Yeah.
Friedman, Joe Rogan. Honestly, I know he gets a lot of flack and a lot of controversy, but I will say 2020 his conversation with Commander David Fravor,
Yeah.
that really just blew my mind because I'd kept my mind open to the UFO subject before, but never really gave it any serious consideration. And it was definitely a lot of stigmatized conversations with friends back then, like, oh, aliens and yada yada. But then hearing from his perspective from, being a military aviator, I was like, wow, I mean, made me want to look into it. And yeah, the rest is history. And then 2021 was a historic year. We had the 60 Minutes piece come out. Fingers crossed that they are coming out with another one because I've seen at least the producer of 60 Minutes. Uh, his name is Graham, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he has at least teased that they're working on something. It was something like, you got to let the food like cook properly before you take it out of the oven or something. But the 60 Minutes piece was really awesome, honestly. It got a lot of my friends interested, family interested, just a lot of people. I think they covered it it was pretty short. I'm sure people have their gripes. Oh, they didn't cover this or that, but I think it was just a good starting point, and a lot of people definitely woke up to that. A neighbor of mine recently, just we were chit chatting, started talking about UAP. They were paying attention from just the news, and I mentioned the 60 Minutes piece, and they're like, "Hey, yeah, I actually remember watching that," and that got me a lot more interested. So, uh, while mainstream media takes a lot of flack from the UFO community right now, and I definitely feel those frustrations because they are lacking in a way. And the public right now, I've seen memes of some of these developments. Some of the congressional hearing happened. There were some memes saying like, "Oh, like the government's talking about aliens and nobody cares," or that sort of thing. And a lot of people online, I mean, to them, it still seems like, why now? Like, why is this all happening? And that's why I
Yeah.
think something like what you're doing, Disclosure Diaries, you're keeping tabs on everything that's going on, everything that's legit. You're trying not to do it in a, nonsensical way. And that's just really important for that reason. Um,
Yeah, I
but
appreciate
yeah,
that.
there's just, with like mainstream media, yes, they're lacking, but there have been some pretty good pieces of coverage, whether they were articles or actual, video segments. And I'm thankful for each and every little one because it is helpful. Um, but we also, as mainstream media is lacking, we have all these folks in the UFO space, quote unquote, that have these podcasts and they're having excellent guests on for interviews and having really high level conversations,
Yeah.
reducing the stigma. And it's definitely been incredibly inspirational to me, super inspirational. Um, and for example, the Merged podcast, that alone, I mean, that I feel like that podcast really brought it up a notch with Ryan Graves
Ryan
being the
Graves.
host.
Yeah.
And I could talk on and on about everything that he's doing from a pilot's perspective. I do have a little bit of an aviation background with powered paragliders. That's where you just got like a motor on your back
Yeah, yeah,
and with the paraglider. And yeah, so the Merge podcast, he's bringing pilots on, military pilots, commercial pilots, and that in and of itself, we hold the military cases, especially from the aviation standpoint, in high regard. So that's great. But we also have commercial pilots that have seen currently still seeing things out there that are unknown. But those sort of cases go back decades and decades.
yeah.
And then branching off of that, we have civilians as well. So um, but having those high level conversations, it's definitely helping reduce the stigma. And I really, really want to see academia just get more involved on all fronts. This conversation is for everybody. The public is going to have their own way to deal with this. Public, as in just the general public. But then we talk about education. I mean, honestly, so we're gonna have to talk about kindergarten through high school, right? Senior year, grade 12, at least here. But then you get into higher academia, undergraduate universities, graduate schools, and so on and so forth. And I think we're going to be heading there. I'm looking forward to the Soul Foundation
Yep.
and
Later this month.
everything that they're about to be doing, because they have a lot of goals and objectives, but overall they're trying to engage academia and just get the general public sort of ready for a quote unquote post disclosure world, from a multidisciplinary approach, which is, I think, ideal. But yeah, looking forward to that. And with Ryan Graves, I just can't, I really appreciate everything that he's done, because for pilots alone, reducing the stigma, I mean, some of the pilots that he's had on there have said, they didn't report their sightings and they had certain reasons. Some of those reasons were fear of repercussions from their supervisors, maybe commercial airlines, but maybe even military, but also stigma as well, fear of
Yeah.
getting made fun
You don't
of.
want to deal with the
And
conversation, right? Yeah.
exactly. So it's really unfortunate. I kind of feel for that, as just having a little bit of some aviation background. Like if I was in the sky and I saw something anomalous like that, like I would want to report that to the authorities or to whoever. But the fact that people have tried to do that and they faced just those unnecessary and unjust repercussions, it just kind of breaks my heart a little bit. But that kind of applies not just to pilots, right? We're talking about some of these whistleblowers, and we're talking about civilians going back
Yeah.
decades. And yeah, it's
No, I think just to touch
yeah,
on that, I think the important aspect is essentially humility, right? Nobody can necessarily confirm nor deny any individual case, although, especially I think in the military cases, there's often multi-sensor data, so perhaps you can confirm it
yeah,
quite easily.
hmm
But I think obviously as you look into the aggregate and you realize just the scale of, as you said, these kind of incidents also going back in history, I think
yeah,
we're way past the point of derision and kind of mocking people for having these kinds of experiences. And perhaps we just kind of need to acknowledge that and just try to understand, or maybe build a framework, an academic framework or philosophical framework, whatever it may be, which I think is also, a big part of what the Soul Foundation is looking to do. And for those perhaps listening or watching who are not familiar, the Soul Foundation will be hosting, I think, their inaugural launch event or inaugural conference later this month. Off the top of my head, something 15th to 17th of November, something like that. I'll put the
yeah. I
link
forgot the
on their
exact date
website as
myself
well.
too, but it's coming up here soon.
Yeah, and there'll be a lot of interesting folks, I think, in attendance with a lot of interesting things to say on the topic. So I would highly recommend tuning into that. I know I will be for sure. Um, I think for the
Could I
most
just
part,
I just could I
yeah,
just add one
go
more
for it.
thing with the academic standpoint? So I've been doing a lot of like advocacy and getting folks to engage with Congress, and that's important. But I also feel I feel like there's so many things that we can try to do. And recently, I just had this idea. I really appreciate my former high school history teacher and the way that he taught her class. It was like junior year, he taught U.S. history, and he just did a good job of covering like everything, the good and the bad, right? And he covered the JFK assassination period, and sort of all he got into the conspiracy theories, but the way that he taught it, I mean, he presented just sort of the facts and kind of the back and forth and analysis, and he still let us students come to our own conclusion. But he really made it interesting, and I just really appreciate him and the way that he taught history. So, considering the history of the UAP topic and where things are going, I mean, it certainly seems like 2024 is going. 2024 will take it up a notch, probably a whole heck of a lot
Mm-hmm.
more than 2023 has. And 2023 is not even over yet. We still have most of November and December to go.
Yeah.
And so I'm honestly trying to be a bit optimistic with the rest of 2023. But with that being said, I think we will need to start seeing eventually the UAP topic being covered in history somewhere in the curriculum, right? At least even in high school. I mean, it definitely can. There already is enough there to be covered, in my opinion. And I think it'd be a way to get students to kind of pay attention a bit more, make it interesting, because now we do have a little bit more insights as to how far back this potentially goes. Because to those paying attention to the UAP conversation, Lou Elizondo, for example, and some other folks like Christopher Mellon, when talking of the UAP phenomenon, they would reference that we're having these sightings nowadays, yes, but this goes back decades, and they were going as far as saying like 70 to about 80 years back. um, but then David Grush came forward, and he's saying this goes back to the 1930s. And through his interview with Jesse Michaels, it's Alchemy American or American Alchemy.
I always
Um,
forget which way around it is. Yeah.
but that was a stellar production, as along with the Yes Theory one. But through their productions, David Grush said like this secrecy ties back to the Manhattan Project, and I really want to know more about that. And I think we definitely need to push our government, at least here in the States, to be transparent as possible, considering that this does go back decades. We have official government involvement. It seems to be that there was a brief era of the certain elements of the U.S. government, being truthful, and then it sort of turned into ridicule, denial, stigma, gaslight, and
Yeah.
yeah. So
No, I think there
there
needs to
is
be
something
a
there.
pretty full accounting of the history. The
Yeah.
question is, and here, we're kind of putting on our speculator hats, but the question also, in my mind, is assuming that there's a there, right? Um, how honest is the government willing to be about its history, especially when investigating itself? Especially when some of these things also go back to the Atomic Energy Act, very very highly
Yes.
classified kind of
Yes.
things, very very high level conversations and teams and projects essentially. So um, I do have my doubts about whether we'll ever really see 100% transparency on the entire sort of history, regardless actually of which way this trend goes. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I hope we at least get the highlights, so to speak, or we get the main kind of points covered. And maybe to that point, and something you've obviously been a big advocate for, I think the select committee kind of seems like a necessary thing at this point, an independent select committee, precisely to kind of go through all of this. And also just something that I think is maybe lost amidst all of the other kind of bombshell claims, but it's the disinformation and the misinformation kind of campaigns. I think again, independent of whether you think the UAP phenomenon represents a real kind of tangible sort of not NHI whatever aspect, I think it's hard to deny that there has been some sort of disinformation or misinformation campaign.
Hmm.
And you can only have to look at like the Condon Report, the Project Blue Book,
Yeah.
to some extent the even the actions of AARO. You know, it's the kind of classic. We'll show you 20 examples of cases that are prosaic and that we can explain, and we'll tell you, you know, there's 2 to 4% that we can't explain, but you're not going to see any of that. And case closed, right?
Right.
It's kind of the classic playbook, really, and you know, the public is by definition interested in the 2 to 4%. That was the reason,
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
these projects and these organizations were set up. So I always find it interesting to see that those kind of get left to the side, and there's not really much talked about, at least publicly, on those. So I think it's hard to argue that there's at least a very minor disinformation campaign going on, and most likely quite a concerted large one that's been going on for decades, I would imagine, on this topic. I don't see
Oh,
any way around that. And I
definitely.
think a select committee would probably be the only way to really dig into that one as well. Obviously, there's a lot of other claims, but I find that one also to be particularly egregious. It's essentially institutional gaslighting, right? And
Yeah.
you think about all the experiencers or whether
Hmm.
they're military or just civilians who've basically just been gaslit by the U.S. government or elements of the U.S. government, I should say. As Lester likes to
Yes.
say, the U.S. government is not a monolith. So, and that's also, again, to be clear, absolutely true. I do believe a lot of these allegations probably pertain to a very small percentage of the intelligence and defense community, and probably is not really representative of the majority of folks that make up the establishment, so to speak. But yeah, so you know, I've covered most of the things that I specifically wanted to cover with you. So at this point, we're just riffing, and I'm curious what are the things that are on your radar. I know a select committee obviously is, but do you have any kind of things on your radar for this year, or any kind of news that you've seen recently that's kind of sparked your curiosity? I'm
Yeah.
happy to
So
hear about it.
definitely. And I agree with everything you just said, especially that disinformation, misinformation campaign targeting the American populace. I mean, it's one thing for the US government to do that to enemies and whatnot, but to do it on our own people. Lou Elizondo, one of the reasons why he's pushing for transparency and accountability is for that reason, right?
Hmm.
We can't do that to our own people. But uh, so one of the things I had this idea. I wanted to reach out to my high school history teacher and kind of see if he'd be interested in perhaps himself incorporating the UAP subject into his curriculum. Maybe he talks about it for one day, or maybe he does like a whole week on it. I don't know. But I kind of pitched like a proposal, like I made this proposal up and sent it his way, and he actually really enjoyed it and said that he personally had at least looked into like Project Blue Book, um, and sort of has looked at it from the Cold War, that sort of era perspective with that lens, and that he's interested. But then at the end of our conversation, he suggested to have me come in and teach his class about it, and I was like, oh my gosh, that would. I was definitely like, hell yeah, sign me up. I would love to. Um, just from a brief overview uh, of the UAP subject, and he's kind of interested in tying it into the Cold War era. And as we kind of mentioned, this does tie into nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, and there's a whole chapter just on that. But so I think that's at least one small step, but it's kind of a personal one, and it's with somebody that I look up to. But I want to, expand from that. So, currently working on a proposal to the chair of the history department at my former undergraduate university where I graduated from. And their background is pretty interesting in and of itself. So this is something I'm working on, and I'll post about it when the time comes if it's right to. But essentially, would like to just get academia again, kind of from a personal level, but like let's take it up a notch and get the history department at least involved, because if at least they start covering the UAP subject, maybe one class, or maybe they cover it somewhere in there, I think is going to be really important just from a historical perspective to bring people up to speed to where we are at now and how we can try to push forward properly as citizens and what to expect from our government and how to just push forward transparency and accountability. But hopefully, in a world where more information is revealed from the government or collected by, let's say, the Galileo Project or Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies, SKEW, or any other organizations that are looking into this, um, we're going to have to get all the other branches involved as well, right? Religion, philosophy, biology, of course, physics, and everything. So I think it's, brick by brick, step by step. And this is just sort of a passion project that I'm doing right now. And fingers crossed that it goes well.
No, I think it's really cool, and
But
I think at least to me, there's obviously a lot of kind of untapped potential and just I think genuine interest in the community, especially I think in younger folks who just want to get involved in this stuff or interested in studying it. And I think just the more kind of bright young minds we can get thinking, at least to some extent, thinking about these things, and ideally with some sort of academic
exactly.
rigor throughout, as you mentioned, all these different disciplines. I think that's fascinating, and I think it's well worth the effort, especially as things seem to be kind of progressing uh, along that line anyway. So I think that's a really cool effort, and I hope you share that with me as well in the near future. I look forward to checking that out. Sounds interesting.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. But that's on my radar. But also on my radar, November, we're looking at a pretty interesting month just with what's publicly known already within the UFO space. There's rumors that there's a lot going to happen, right? But we know, so Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, he's having a public sort of panel with the Hayden Center, and I believe this will be live streamed on YouTube. And then thankfully, the public will get to ask questions. And you've put together some really great questions online. I remember you posted like a Twitter
Yep,
thread kind of questions.
I've been spamming it.
Yeah,
Rare opportunity, right, to put some questions to Dr. Kirkpatrick from the public. I don't really have high hopes of direct answers, but I think I also discussed this with Lester. You know, we may as well begin asking the right questions. We may not get the answers we want, but it's an improvement over not really asking the right questions at all.
yeah, certainly. Yeah, I recommend anyone listening, if they haven't seen Mo's questions, to check that out. Maybe it'll spark some ideas. And I think definitely some of your questions should definitely be asked. There needs to be accountability from at least the leadership of AARO. I have my own personal gripes with that office, but that mainly stems from Dr. Kirkpatrick and his leadership. And I don't just want to hate on him. I have posted some criticism of him online. But David Grush, for example, he was a part of the UAP task force, and he came forward, and I certainly think that he is a hero, at least in my books. For he's trying to do the right thing, and I applaud him for that endeavor. And unfortunately, it hasn't been an easy thing for him and his family. And so I really just underscores my gratitude for him and other whistleblowers that are coming forward, because um, perhaps we could get a little bit into sort of the secrecy aspect, but I can't imagine having to deal with that. And at the end of the day, these people are trying to do the right thing coming forward.
For sure.
Um, but I kind of lost my train of thought there, but
No worries, no worries. But like just to touch again on Kirkpatrick, I know he obviously gets a lot of
yes,
flack online, and I think he's
exactly.
kind of made it hard on himself with a lot of the, let's say, inconsistencies. But I will go back to, I think it was April or maybe even before then when uh, he appeared on, I think he gave some testimony to, I think it was the House Armed Services Committee. And I must say, like, I was somewhat impressed. Like, he seemed like an academic, guy with the scientific approach, and obviously he's dealing with a topic that has potentially, you know, historic, massive consequences, and he seemed to be approaching that with, I think, nuance and humility and just rigor at the time, at least. And even like one thing that really struck me at the time, and maybe the specifics of the quotes elude me, but the impression that I got was that he was trying to very kind of politically um, let the folks know that he wasn't getting the right access, that he didn't have the right
Mm.
clearances. He wasn't necessarily getting all of the approvals in time and things like that. And I think I think the
Yeah,
website came up at that time where they
it
were,
did.
lambasting him
It did.
for where is this website, and essentially he was,
Yeah.
again, very politically, without. It seemed to me that he was trying not to step on any toes, and I do have some
Hmm.
understanding of those types of environments where, he's kind of a cog in a much larger kind of mechanism, and he's probably not calling the shots, and he has a variety of different stakeholders with different intentions, and probably some of them are a little bit
Yeah.
more senior than him. Um, and it seemed like he was trying to navigate that extremely politically, and he wasn't trying to throw anyone under the bus. And I think he, again, with regards to the website, said something along the lines of, and I might be misquoting him, but they'd submitted something 6 months ago, a year ago, and never really gotten anything back, and perhaps maybe I think it was Senator Gillibrand, maybe you could set up a meeting with my superiors and you guys could discuss it. And basically saying, look, my hands are tied here. Uh, I've tried to do what I can, and please, can you help fix this? Maybe you have more sway than I do, right? At least, again, this is my personal subjective opinion of how that went down at the time. So I did have an impression of him as perhaps a bit of a guy in a thankless job, right? He's in a thankless job with limited autonomy, trying to do the bare minimum from a scientific perspective in terms of actually approaching this topic with seriousness. But ultimately, he's uh, in a jungle with quite a few different predators and prey around him,
Hmm.
and kind of having to be careful about what he does. Um,
Yeah.
since then, however, he's kind of flip flopped in some strange ways, and I'm sure you're probably also familiar. He did co-write a very strange paper with Avi Loeb about motherships and drones and orbs and things like that. So I know he has
Right.
I would assume he has a personal affinity, perhaps, with some of these topics, and perhaps his own speculations and theories, which I think would probably align a lot closer with a lot of the UFO crowd than people might be
Hmm.
willing to admit.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he has also, for example, thrown David Grush under the bus very publicly,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
which I find very hard to square with my previous impression of him. So
Yeah.
I usually saw him as very measured, very guarded, very careful about what he's saying, trying not to step on any toes. But he
Hmm.
did a lot more than step on David Grush's toes and essentially called him a liar. Or they're both calling each other liars, to be clear,
Right.
in not as many words, but essentially that's what it boils down to. And obviously, we're gonna
I agree.
get to the bottom of that in the next few weeks. Um, so I do I just find him a very interesting character, and I hope we get more information in the future about what exactly has transpired with Doctor K, as we call him lovingly. Uh,
I
we'll have to.
agree. I agree.
It,
And
it would be fascinating, I think.
yeah, 100%. Maybe some people say maybe he'll have like a Dr. J. Allen Hynek sort of twist
Yeah.
where he
Mhm.
later starts, advocating for transparency. I don't know. We'll see. But I remember what I was trying to say earlier, and that was with, David Grush, UAP Task Force. A lot of us consider him a hero. I hope that there are people like David Grush working for AARO right now, or they're,
Mhm.
liaison, because we don't know really anybody that's working in that office. So Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, he's sort of the public face. He is the director, so there is that aspect to it. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of nuances. There's all these different people that he's giving advice to, that he's receiving advice from. Surely he's got his own personal speculation and hypotheses. considering all the information that he's exposed to, right? Classified data. Um, yeah, surely out of at least one of those anomalous cases, I'm thinking, I mean, it's just kind of a no-brainer. Like, what is that they're looking at? Um, but that's just speculation. We don't know at the end of the day. Um, but I understand it would be a hard job, but at the same time, like you mentioned, his sort of stance with David Grush, where he said, David Grush, like we extended an invite to, have communications with him. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially that. And then David Grush, and this just happened in this last week.
Yeah.
Um, and David Grush essentially said that no, like there have been no communications, and that is a lie. So it's very unfortunate from that angle. And we've also heard from other reports that whistleblowers don't seem to trust
Hmm.
reporting to AARO.
Yeah, I think
And
trust them by their actions, right? Like all these whistleblowers have apparently gone straight to the ICIG or the DODIG or even the various intel committees, which I think
or
speaks
Congress
volumes,
even.
or Congress exactly,
Yeah,
which speaks volumes to the amount of trust that these people have in the established kind of office for that kind of stuff.
exactly. And something that we were talking about earlier, like the times we're in, this is very unprecedented from a historical perspective, because now we have all these whistleblowers that are, testifying behind the scenes. Um, but so with Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, though, another thing that was reported on recently from Matt Ford of the Good Trouble Show was that he has been receiving advice from some sort of secretive group that consists of a couple gatekeepers from the legacy UAP program, which is that's a very stunning allegation to say the
Hmm.
least. And you made some really good points, with Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick in that first initial hearing. Like, I remember a lot of people online were like, "Oh, that hearing was like bogus or whatever." But at that time too, I did appreciate some of the nuances to that. With we're trying to do this from a scientific perspective, but then considering kind of the historical, like we've already had
Hmm.
Project Blue Book and everything. It's
We've
like,
heard that one
all right,
before.
like exactly, like let's push the ball a bit further nowadays. Let's get to that. But I think that will happen eventually, especially with us pushing. But um, yeah, him receiving getting advice from some of these quote unquote gatekeepers. I mean, that is troubling. And if, let's say, some of these whistleblowers knew that some way, somehow, I mean, none of us know really how the intel world works like, and, how this conversation subject and everything going on right now is happening from those whistleblowers'
Yeah.
perspectives. For us, it's one thing in the public, but for their perspective, especially if they're a firsthand witness from this legacy UAP program or programs, I mean, I can't even imagine. And if they're going to AARO to testify and they know, like, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick is actually receiving advice from some of these people that they know personally don't want for information to come forward. They don't want these whistleblowers to go through the appropriate authorities, Arrow being one of them, and that they actually have a say to that process. I mean,
Yeah.
um,
I mean, this is
it is pretty
one of these questions that
pretty
needs to be put
shocking.
to Sean, right? Just to clarify,
Yeah.
because I think at the very least, it's from that same testimony, I think, to the House Armed Services Committee. He did
Hmm.
literally name, I think it's the Senior Technical Advisory Group. They always have
Yes.
fancy names, the STAG, uh,
Hmm.
which I think to this day consists of unnamed members. And the way he was describing it as part of his process, this is essentially kind of the last filter. So after all of the analysis has been done, after the red team versus the blue team, whatever they call it, the various kind of scientific approaches they take, there's one last little final layer, which is this
Hmm.
tag, um, which, if it's, especially if it's that very important final layer, I think it's imperative that
Yeah.
the public knows who is part of that group. And it wouldn't have been a big deal, I think, if he'd named them right then and there. But the longer you avoid naming them and coming up with whatever reasons not to do so, again, it speaks to this sort of misinformation, disinformation theme of, if it isn't a psyop or if it isn't some sort of disinformation campaign, you're doing a very, you're making it very difficult for yourself if you
Hmm.
obfuscate to this extent. What am I supposed to assume, right? Like it's
Right.
just very strange, you know. And it kind of goes back to that sort of gaslighting thing where if you're meant to be this office that's founded on ideals of transparency and opening up and maybe even some public reporting and things like that, you can't have a secret senior technical advisory group kind of as the final filter for all of your case recommendations. It's honestly laughable. So I hope that's one of
Yeah.
the things that gets raised as well, just to clarify. Again, if he's not willing to name them, then I would like to hear a very cogent kind of justification for that, because it escapes me. It's
Well,
bizarre.
to add on to that point right there, yeah, I would like to hear his reasoning about this and just get his perspective. But I think he needs to be asked this by somebody in media. Hopefully, on the day of this panel, that question does get brought up, because it's very shocking, you know. And we hold these people to high regard in terms of their roles and responsibilities. And I mean, at the end of the day, people are saying our taxpayer dollars are going into this program.
Mm-hmm.
So there needs to be a sense of accountability, and um, there's a lot of implications if all of this is true, that he is receiving uh, counsel from this secretive group of people, that he's refused to share the names of those people with at least Congress members. You know, the public is one thing, but even with
Mm-hmm.
Congress, that's what the allegations have been. But Matt Ford did say that some of these people in Congress now have that list. So that is actually very interesting. And maybe with that development, as I mentioned, it'd be great to see some sense of accountability from Dr. Kirkpatrick on that publicly. But if not, it will be interesting to see how perhaps, I don't know who these congressional members are, but maybe let's see what sort of uh, steps of action that they take. I mean, the UAP Disclosure Act, for example, the senators, they're very quiet on all of this right now.
Yeah.
But the UAP Disclosure Act at the same time is like a whole different ball game, whole different, like, why are they talking about non-human intelligence multiple times and going back decades and collecting historical documents? It's like, why?
It seems
But
like a lot
you
of
know,
work that's gone into that amendment at a time where we're,
yeah,
insanely high geopolitical tension, many,
yeah,
let's call it real world problems, so to speak, for Congress people and senators to be dealing with. And yet they somehow found the time to write a 64-page amendment all about non-human intelligence. Um,
agreed.
and again, I think Chuck Schumer in a statement, he had four priorities for this administration, which are fentanyl, uh, dealing with AI, dealing with China, and UAP. It was literally those
Yes,
four. Those are his priorities.
exactly.
And those are his words. These are not the
Mm-hmm.
words of some lunatic on UFO Twitter. These are the words
Yeah.
of Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. So what am I supposed to do with that information, right? Besides speculate, for now at least.
Right.
And very much looking forward to seeing some developments on the NDAA. So seeing whether the UAPDA passes as it was written, or if there's going to be some amendments to that as well, which I think are probably likely, as they're working on that compromise bill with Congress at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So very much looking out for that. That's going to be fascinating to see how that
Yeah.
develops. And I think,
And
as
could I
I
just add
mentioned,
with the,
no, go for it,
sorry,
please,
I didn't
please,
mean to cut
please.
you off. With the UAP Disclosure Act, I just wanted to mention, it's, the implications are profound, and I know there's, you know, little nitty gritty sort of criticisms of the legislation, like eminent domain, for
Mm-hmm.
example. There's a really good article from the Debrief um, that was just released, and I recommend people look at that article if they want to kind of get into the nitty gritty of it, because it is important to consider. Um, but with the UAP Disclosure Act, I just want to say, so for 2 weeks, pretty much like mid September to the end, a lot of us in the quote unquote UFO community, you know, people seeking transparency and accountability on this subject, we all got together and just made a lot of phone calls. We were sending emails, and Nick Gold, for example, the founder of declassifyuap.org, made it really super simple way to engage your own personal representatives on declassifying UAP. And then, Lester, huge shout out to Lester. With UAP Caucus, he created like a speed dial feature that sort of made it easier to make the phone calls. And the rest of UAP Caucus is just really great. It's a great way for people in the public that want to know more about UAP without dig. It's hard to study the subject because when you look up things maybe on YouTube or online, you're gonna find like some
Yep.
sort of wacky thing, and then it's just really hard to wade through this subject. And thankfully, there are just a lot of level-headed people out there looking into this nowadays, and it's gonna happen. I think it will happen where we'll see more of that spreading. And I think through conversations like we're having and that other folks are having, like the Merch podcast and so many other different platforms, help reduce the stigma, help us have these conversations. But I just want to give a huge shout out to everybody that took action during those 2 weeks. Like, it blew my mind. It was just insane to see like so many people making calls throughout those 2 weeks, and to the point where we were calling staffers, and you tell them, hey, I'm calling about UAP. They're like, oh, you're calling about that UAP Disclosure Act, right? And or the UAP
That's
legislation. And it's
progress right
like,
there.
yeah, you got it. And they're like, all right, well, I'll note that down and pass it on. It's like, all right, like that's a bare minimum I feel like we could do. But it is the best when we have a lot of people making calls, because when I first started out, yeah, I was making the calls and I was interested in the subject. And for me, we were talking about that balance. Focusing on like your own life is important too, but taking action is a good way to kind of um, let your passions out, I guess, or to express your passions. And so that was sort of an outlet for me as well. Um, but I didn't know like what was happening after I make a call. When you make a call to one of these staffers and they take your message, like what happens after the phone ends? And I got some insights from a few folks, and if they're watching, huge shout out to you. You know who you are. Um, but essentially, after you make the phone call, those calls get logged, especially if you're a constituent. Like I said, sometimes if you are not a constituent, um, they just straight up will not take your message at all. Sometimes they may take your message, but they'll say, I can't log it, so I'll just kind of pass it through word of mouth sort of situation. Um, but these calls get logged, and pretty much at the end of the day or at the end of the week, these senators or these representatives are getting told, like, hey, we had, X amount of calls on healthcare and X amount of calls on gun violence and all these issues, but UAP nowadays, there's going to be more of an increase in that numbers, which I think that needs to happen, right? We need this to be an issue that Congress takes seriously. And another shout out to Matt Laszlo with Ask a Poll, doing some really good work, boots on the ground in DC, getting immediate word from the people in Congress that represent us. And we get a gauge of who's actually for transparency, who is interested in this subject, wants to know more, and who's just kind of dilly dallying around,
Yeah, no, I agree with
And
that.
during the summer, like um, Vinnie and I, we did this call to action focusing on senators within the Senate Armed Services Committee
Hmm.
and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, because Senator Gillibrand's on both sides. Um, and around that time, yeah, we made all these calls, and I was hopeful, like, I hope this is making a difference, because we do have quite a bit of people making calls right now. Um, Matt Laszlo, he's on the ground, and I think it was the month of July where he interviewed like over 100 of these people in Congress about like just David Grush or UAP, and like holy cow, like that's insane. But he put together an Excel table of which senators were looking into this, like they're really interested, who's kind of in the middle area, and then who's just straight up like they have no idea and are kind of even ridiculing the subject. And then I feel like I was able to get a better gauge as to where some of these folks in Congress are. And then now to present day, he's still on the beat like no other. And really just helps not just me, but all of us that are keenly paying attention as to where these folks in Congress stand and how we can push forward for more transparency and accountability.
100%. And I think, I say this probably in every video I make, but I say
Please say
important.
it.
It's UAP transparency is an agnostic position, right? It's not, you're not making any claims about where this is going. You're not injecting any of your own personal dogma when you ask for UAP transparency. It's a very neutral position to take. It's I think undeniable. As soon as you have, again, people like Chuck Schumer, Marco Rubio, Gillibrand, all these folks saying relatively incredible things, and they're even sponsoring legislation that says relatively incredible things, and you have whistleblowers, and if you put all of these things together, there is something here that needs to be investigated. I think we're way beyond debating that. Obviously, there's some people that believe, that this investigation will lead to path X, and some people think path Y. That's absolutely fine. I
Mm-hmm.
think everyone has their opinion. Some people are more skeptical. Some people are less skeptical. That's absolutely fine. I think it's healthy. I encourage that. But at the end of the day, the only way we really move forward is increasing transparency. As you mentioned, Nick Gold has a very good list of declassification targets. Those would be a great start. Just more data, essentially, right? More data for the academics to get their teeth into, more data for the public to get up to speed. And I think, there's just an opportunity here to rebuild a lot of trust that I think has been lost in our institutions. And ultimately, whether you're a hardcore skeptic, hardcore believer, or just a normal regular Joe who's heard a few strange things over the past few months, then I think the least we can ask for is transparency. So that's that's
100%.
my that's my spiel that I need to get out in every video. So I thank you for leading me right to it.
Yes,
Um,
sir. I agree.
as we're at the end of this conversation, essentially, I just wanted to see, is there any kind of like last thoughts you would leave with um, someone who's perhaps dipping their toes into this space for the first time, or maybe someone who's been involved for quite a while and is unsure of how to start? What would you say is the best way to kind of get started, get active, and be productive about it? What would you say to someone like that?
Right now, so I would recommend a few websites, honestly. So I would recommend UAPcaucus.com. Uh, and again, huge shout out to Lester for
Mm-hmm.
creating that. He's done an exceptional job. And he's really just, it's a way to try to encourage the public to look into UAP and sort of how to navigate that. He's got a bunch of different guides on there that go into depth about certain aspects of the UAP conversation. There's a newsroom section where it's got all these really exceptional pieces of journalism about the UAP subject. And we've got, on there the whole sort of call to action, right? Getting people engaged with Congress. And that is just a really good way for people to, if they have that passion, that energy for this topic, or for anybody new that is wanting to seek transparency. Another just little side tangent, a different former high school teacher of mine, she's kind of been paying attention to some of my posts about UAP on social media and stuff like that. And she's just really interested in it. And huge shout out to her. She's been even taking action, like when I put call scripts out, and it's just really awesome to see because from her perspective, she just wants transparency and accountability at the end of the day. At the end of the day, simply put, and so there's that avenue, and there's going to be updates on UAP caucus. Lester is really good about doing that, especially when we have these briefings, for example, like the DODIG. We've got the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, that SCIF meeting coming up. And I believe, UAP caucus is going to be working on another briefing document for
Yeah.
these staffers in Congress to take a look at. So it's a way for the public to get engaged, to learn something new, to take action, but it's also a way for these folks in Congress to get involved as well. And then Nick Gold, as I mentioned earlier, and we've talked about his website, declassifyuap.org. That's another great starting point. He's got a good list of declassification targets, like why do we want more data or data, on UAP to be declassified, and it's a good way to get educated in a way. And then um, I would also recommend the Liberation Times,
Yeah.
Christopher Sharp, and he also collaborates with other folks as well, getting their insights and analysis. Liberation Times, his articles, or I should say their articles, um, range from a whole variety of different news developments, such as maybe pilot sightings or personnel sightings, to sort of what's going on behind the scenes, how certain folks in Congress are uh, looking into UAP or what they're doing. Matt Laszlo of Askapol, I would recommend him because he's really just providing these daily updates about where these congressional folks are on UAP, because the setting that he gets them, it's not a news sort of setup
Yeah,
where
it's
you
one
get
more
that
organic.
soundbite.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's more organic, it's more conversational. So get some really interesting insights from there. But I think those are some good starting points. Because not everybody uses Twitter, but just those websites themselves. Because I will say on UAP Caucus as well, because there's so many other ones like that are out there. But on UAP Caucus, there's a tab that is dedicated to other organizations and resources.
Yeah.
So that's going to have everything in there where folks can look at it, because we have the taking action perspective. You're getting that from declassifyuap.org, uapcaucus.com. There's UAP Med, for example. So they're trying to bring in medical professionals to normalize the UAP conversation within the medical field, which is going to be a really important thing. Is an important thing now, but certainly going forward, where the conversation is heading. And then we also have, on there's like different resources. The AIAA, American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, they've got technical papers on there, and the SKU, Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies, they've got research papers on there. So maybe folks in academia looking at this, they could see those papers. Anybody in aviation could see that. And so there's something there for everybody. I think if you're just somebody interested in it from a general perspective, you could go there. But yeah, I think those are some great starting points. And then if you're just interested in, uh, you know, maybe interviews with different figures and whatnot, or different researchers or government officials, I would recommend Disclosure Team. Vinnie Adams runs that, and there's just so many podcasts now that I'm thinking of it. That UFO podcast. Um, there's a new one, Elephant in the Room, that's from Chris and Ariel. They just started. They've had Chrissy Newton on there, and they're gonna have Randall Nickerson coming up. So there's so many podcasts. I really apologize if I haven't named all of them out there, but those are some really good starting points because they've just had a diverse amount of people. Theories of everything. You've got more of a sort of nuanced. He gets kind of nitty gritty with
Mm-hmm.
physicists and philosophical perspectives. There's just so much out there. But if anyone's watching this, I mean, if you are on Twitter, I mean, don't hesitate to reach out. I mean, I would be more than happy to guide anybody. I'm sure you would be as well, Mo. And I'm sure a lot of other people out there would too. So uh, definitely that. And
Yeah, I think you
one
gave
thing I just wanted,
no, go for it, please. Sorry, my bad.
well, you're good. Well, I'm not sure how much time you've got left here, but one thing I wanted to ask you was if you've had any personal sightings of your own. And I apologize if you've mentioned this before, but I was
No, I
curious
haven't.
about
I
that.
haven't. I haven't to both questions. I have not mentioned it on any video or
Gotcha.
podcast, but I have not had any what do you call it, UAP? Let's say aerial phenomena. That much I can say. I've had my fair share of interesting experiences. Let me put it that way.
Hmm.
So I do have a very open mind in terms of the breadth of um, anomalous experiences, let's say, that the human condition is capable of experiencing. So that's about as far as I would go on that topic. I've been told to keep my eyes up
Gotcha.
um, by multiple people, and you know
Yeah.
I have I'll be honest, I have started looking at the sky a lot more, and even amongst my friends, anytime they
Nice.
see a plane fly by, they'll quickly point it out and be like, "Mo, what's that?" Funnily enough, I'm in Indonesia at the moment, and there's quite a lot of kites. So it's like I guess it's
Hmm.
part of the culture. They fly these kites, and sometimes they have quite odd shapes. So if you're driving around and you see like a strange shape in the sky, like I must admit I catch myself every single time thinking, "Huh, is it happening?" So that's quite funny. Um,
I don't blame you, man. But hey, that's good. That's a positive, right? I mean, you're looking at the sky more, and I mean, me personally, like I've just always been a stargazer, like
mhm.
by heart. And since the pandemic, I've been taking more like time lapses outside during the night. So a lot of those nights, I would just be out there already, just kind of chilling, and I would just have a time lapse going. Maybe I'm hanging out with some friends, and just let the time lapse do its thing, just enjoying the night sky, like we're talking about UAP, and there's a whole lot of nitty gritty topics that we could get into. But at the end of the at the end of the day or end of the night, we just look up to the night sky and wonder what's out there, and just think about our place in the stars. And I think that's just really profound and important. But you just yeah, definitely look up because you never know what you'll see. I will at least say that I've had at least three sightings where I would say they're unknown, but I can't really,
Can't
you
go
know,
much further than
say
that. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. I can't say, yo, for sure it was something I saw of non-human origin. I can't go that far, but with my bit of aviation background, I'm in the sort of medical field right now, but as a kid, what did I want to be when I grew up? Sort of question. I used to think of meteorology,
Hmm.
weatherman, because I just really am fascinated with just meteorology and weather phenomenon. So I've just always been looking up clouds, just I'm just one of those types of people, like cloud lovers, right?
Skygazer.
So I've just looked up at the sky like so much, night and day throughout the years. I'm really thankful I was doing that like from a young age, especially in my high school years, going into college. But these three sightings all happened since 2020, and I feel like I have a bit more of knowledge of natural phenomenon in the sky and satellites and flares and all of that. And I just to this day am still pretty bamboozled as to what I saw. And they were all three sort of different sightings. And if you're interested, I could go into it, but I know we're coming here at the end, so I don't want to go on for too long. Maybe we could save that for a different time.
For
But
sure, yeah, yeah. No, I would love to have you on more regularly. I think that's something also I think with all my guests, what I really want to encourage is just continued dialogue, conversations, and just kind of keeping each other sane, keeping the
yeah,
dialogue at a high level. I think that's really important.
yeah,
And in general, I try to create an environment where ideally people would want to come back and maybe even cross pollinate with some of the different guests you've mentioned. Quite a few of the folks that um, I've already had on, or will be hopefully having on in the near future. So I'm also looking forward to maybe getting a little bit more group discussions going on in the future. I think that'd be really cool. Unfortunately, Ronak,
Heck yeah.
I do have to run in a couple of minutes, so I'm gonna have to cut it here.
No
But
worries,
just
man. I
as a
understand.
final note, I was wondering what's the best way for folks to stay up to date with what you're up to. You've mentioned a couple of cool things you're working on, and I've obviously been following you for quite a while. So would that be Twitter? What's the handle? Give yourself a shout out. I'll obviously link it everywhere as well myself. But just for the folks listening, what's the best way to keep up with what you're working on?
No, yeah, sure thing. So yeah, if folks want to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is it's my first name Ronak, so that's Ronak, and then Pat 42. So it's at Ronak Pat 42. I'm on Twitter. I mainly tend to commentate on the UAP subject and definitely put out some call to actions and whatnot, and try to get people going. And then sometimes I may just tweet out something random. You just never know. But I try to stay, pretty focused on the UAP subject. But really, I try to be kind to people and respectful. I mean, especially with encouraging people to engage with Congress. We not just Congress. I mean, anybody that we engage with about any topic, like it's good to be respectful. It fosters an open space and open dialogue. People feel heard. It's important to have people, feel like they're heard, and for them to be heard and to just have a nice, respectful dialogue, in a respectful way that's also not too serious. I really appreciated this conversation, and there's just so many things we could continue to keep talking about. But I really appreciate everything that you've been doing, Mo. And to everybody watching, please, take care of yourself and prioritize yourself. This UAP subject is quite a bit to consider, and the implications are profound. But please take care of yourself, and we'll always keep pushing. And really thankful for everything that you're doing, Mo. And looking
Appreciate it.
forward to our next discussion. We'll keep in touch.
For sure, will do. And thanks again for coming on, and hope to have you on soon. Take care, man.
Thank you. Really appreciate you.